Well, thank you, Eddie, and it is a pleasure to be here once again to engage in this conversation and dialogue, because we all believe that leads to better outcomes, and that's what this is about, along with the swimming and the socialising this week. So it's great to be here once again. I met, coming in this afternoon, a former economics lecturer of mine, Sean Byrne, I hadn't seen for a long time. And you never get the opportunity at a forum like this to actually thank people who've helped you when you're a young man. So I learned a lot from Sean, so thank you, Sean, for all your insights. I learned a lot about public policy and welfare economics. I'm not going to say how long ago it was, but it wasn't yesterday. It was a few years ago, so good to see you, Sean. And I'm delighted that Eddie mentioned where we've come from, because I think when we're talking about public policy challenges of the type we're talking about this afternoon, perspective is critical. And I spoke here in 2011 when there was a lot of criticism, correct criticism of politicians and regulators and bankers and civil servants. But many of those politicians and civil servants have been instrumental in getting us to where we are now. And in many ways, we're dealing, when we talk about infrastructure and the challenges of delivering infrastructure, we are talking about some of the challenges of success as opposed to the challenges of failure, the policy challenges that we faced in 2011. It won't come as a surprise to anybody that I have a slightly different take on infrastructure provision in Ireland than my good friend Dr. McCarthy. That mightn't come as a surprise to anybody. And I think you need to stand back looking at infrastructure and look at the quality of infrastructure and how it's improved. And I look at the motorway network, the road network. I spent a lot of the last 24 hours around Glenties waiting at traffic lights for various roadworks that are taking place, an incredible amount of activity. But look at the transformation of the road network, look at the gas, the electricity network, improvements in the water network. I was in Berlin a few weeks ago, and to contrast the airport facilities in Berlin, which is an incredibly rich city, incredibly sophisticated company in Germany, and contrast those facilities with Dublin Airport or Cork Airport or Shannon Airport, whatever about Sligo is in a different place now, and look at third level education, the transformation in the stock of infrastructure in the third level sector. I was in DCU last week out in Glasnevin, and there are now 18,000 students in DCU. When I did my Leaving Cert in the late 80s, I used to go up there to study, and there were less than 1,000 students in DCU. And that's within a generation. So there's been enormous transformation. Many projects are delivered on time and on budget. But of course we don't hear about that. We hear about the issues that go wrong. And of course when it comes to what we call once-off or bespoke type projects, there are particular challenges, and I'll talk about those in a moment. It's hard to think back though on a significant bespoke once-off project that hasn't had difficulties. People always talk about Ardna Crusha and the great vision that led to the development of Ardna Crusha in the 1920s. There were significant overruns on that project. The Department of Finance, my colleagues in the Department of Finance, the predecessors of Michael and I, back in the 1920s, had long disputes with Siemens about how much to pay. I think they were looking for £750,000 over the original bid price, and they settled on a few hundred thousand. So even that iconic project, there were disputes all those years ago. But I think when we think about capital projects, it needs to be seen in the context of the National Development Plan. And this is a plan to continue the transformation of this country, over 100 billion of spend over the next 15 to 20 years. And it is an initiative programme. And there's a lot of discussion about project delays and projects coming in and out. That's the nature of a multi-annual project, because it's impossible to predict with certainty that a certain project will be ready to be funded at a particular point in time. So this plan needs to be seen as an initiative plan. And there are projects there which aren't cast in stone. And the government needs to make decisions, this government and subsequent governments, about the right projects and the right programmes to pursue. A key aspect of the plan, which we haven't focused on this afternoon, which is critical, a key objective, is how do we cater for the extra million people who will live in this country over the next 15, 20 years? And where are we going to build the 500,000 homes that we need? And issues around the Children's Hospital and broadband, these are very important issues. But the really big policy issue that we need to grapple with as a country, as I see it, is this. Do we continue with the unplanned, urban sprawl, developer-led sprawl of our cities, with all the impacts that has for climate objectives, for congestion, for productivity? Or do we go for a different model of development where we decide to focus on strategic cities and towns and have compact growth with high density growth? And that, to me, is the biggest issue. Do we have the political, institutional capacity to develop our country in a different way and to avoid some of the mistakes we've had over the previous generations? And that's really what the National Development Plan is about. It's about linking with the spatial development. It's for the first time having a proper discussion about land and land use and how that's linked to capital. And it's about reducing the dominance of Dublin. So Dublin will grow by 25% compared to 75% the growth outside of Dublin. And it's about developing the core city areas of Limerick, Cork, Galway and Waterford in a way which is much more sustainable than we've done in the past. And when I consider the capital projects, I see it in the context of this multi-annual programme and how it links to the spatial plan for the country. Because we can't think about capital without thinking about where people will live, about communities and ultimately homes. There, of course, is a lot of discussion about cost overruns. And I think there is some confusion here about what that actually means. So if, let's say, as an example, if Joe, here's a thought process for people, for the 40th MacGill, we decided we're going to build a new hall. Let's say we're going to go mad, have a splash. I don't know how much money's in the kitty job. We're going to go mad, build a new hall. So how much do we think it's going to cost to build? $1 million? $2 million? We can all have a guess. We won't really know until somebody comes forward with a detailed tender based on a detailed specification and says, I'll build it for $4 million. So if the project comes in at $4.5 million, the cost overrun is not $4.5 million versus $1 million, the guesstimate of what we thought the hall would cost to build. It's relative to the actual tender. And there's an awful lot of misinformation and confusion about this in the public discourse. When somebody says the hall is going to cost $1 million, that's just a guess, a guesstimate. It's only when somebody has a detailed cost based on detailed specifications does that have any validity. And a lot of the public discourse on this, unfortunately, is a little bit misguided. I have a few slides, if I can get this to work. The column has broken it. The other way. So this is just, it's not an Irish phenomenon, the challenge that we face in actually delivering bespoke projects. And again, if you look back at the situation we had with the motorway network in the past, when we were developing the motorway network 25 years ago, the first number of projects, there were major issues around the tender specification, cost overruns, significant rows with developers or the builders around price variation clauses. But we got better. And after a number of projects then, we were able to deliver it pretty much on time and on budget. And there's a big difference between doing a repeat project like a road or a school or a police station compared to different type of projects. But you can look here at some of the cost overruns internationally. It's not an Irish phenomenon. It's also not a public sector phenomenon. And you hear this sometimes, public sector awful stuff, and the private sector, they do it much better. That is not the case. You don't hear about it if it's the private sector. So if something happens with a company and they're building something, they built in a premium, they built in contingencies, and they deal with the consequences of that in the boardroom, not in the pages of the Irish Times or an RT. So it is different. As I mentioned, our cost performance is improving. I could put up a graphic related to a whole variety of other aspects of infrastructure, but just an example I mentioned. On the road side, over time, a very significant improvement in our ability to say we're going to build a motorway of a certain length with a certain number of flyovers and so forth, and it's going to cost X. And our performance is impressive. And in other areas, we're seeing that as well. I just wanted to mention, though, the issue around the larger projects, the bespoke projects, and so on. And really the challenge for us to get more cost certainty and to provide more assurance for the political system and the public and the taxpayer is to have much greater discussion about the specification of a project. So if we're going to build something, we need to spend much more time and money on the specification. And we also need to have thorough independent reviews, and I take what Colin has said about the use of consultants, independent reviews of those costs to ensure that we have a realistic assessment, and then we can make a decision ultimately on whether it represents value for money or not. And there is an optimism bias, a very significant optimism bias here I was in, and it's not just related to projects. I was in a bar last night talking to some Donegal football fans debating their prospects against Dublin. I think there's a bit of an optimism bias there too in some of those discussions, but we shall see. It's not just related to this issue. And we can be afflicted in aspects of our walk of life where we do believe this will work out and this will be fine. And we need to be honest with ourselves and have a thorough review. And ultimately, for the political system can't fully commit itself to doing something until it's seen the final cost, the business case, and a revision of the benefits and costs of the project when they finally see the tender. So in terms of the future of these large projects, these mega projects, our Minister, I always have to mention the Minister at these events, our Minister, Minister Donoghue, will bring proposals to government in September to make changes to how we go about planning and delivering these projects. At the centre of it, reflecting what Colin has said, is the centrality of the Public Spending Code. The Public Spending Code has to be, once again, reformed. And the reason it's updated and reformed is because the world moves on. Things change. It would be worse if we were pretending that the document we had in the 1970s would be fit for purpose for the challenges we face today. It's clearly not. But we need to have that document updated and be central to the decision-making process when it comes to projects. We need to have a higher risk premium for projects which are uncertain, and that risk premium will reduce over time as we go through different stages of the project. We need to have better risk-sharing arrangements between the government and contractors and have much more of a culture of challenge. And I guess that's the key thing, to have within government departments and agencies, and more generally, much more of a culture of challenge, where we can say, do we really believe that view? Is that a correct view? Have we adjusted for optimism bias? Is there a sufficient premium for risk and contingency? And critically, and this is where the politics gets very difficult, critically for government, this government and future governments, to be able to walk away from projects to which they're committed when they see that ultimately the costs are greater than they had originally expected. And that is very, very difficult, because we all know there's politics vested in projects, and governments will be accused unfairly of U-turning when they make the sensible decision to change their mind. It's okay sometimes to change your mind, apparently. And finally, it's to have active management of projects during construction. And we have, in many agencies, the capacity to do this, but other parts of the public service we need to get better, to have people who can actually work with contractors. And this is literally a war of attrition. Contractors, their job is to maximise their profits by increasing the price, and it's the job of those on the public service side to ensure the interests of the taxpayer are represented. So there's some of the ideas that we're talking about. Just more generally, and I'll finish up on these points, Chair, the context for delivery of our capital plan is the fact that we now have a construction sector, and it's incredible to think of where we came from, where most of the unemployed people who work in construction are now gainfully employed once again. And we are starting to see very significant increases in tender prices, and these have to be reflected in the prices that we pay for our infrastructure. And this is a challenge for us as we increase spending on capital, and as if the private sector continues to grow rapidly. How are we going to meet these infrastructure needs at a price which represents value for money? And this is a challenge for us all, government departments, political level, but for society. And it will need for us to have debates about ultimately priorities and trade-offs, because there are many things we would like to do, which we're going to have to do over a different time frame, depending on how circumstances evolve. A big issue, again, which doesn't receive too much focus, is the performance of the construction sector. Ultimately, the inefficiency, low productivity, relatively poor productivity of the sector is reflected in the prices that we all have to pay for infrastructure. And this graph might be hard to read, but the basic story is that there's been very little improvement in productivity in the construction sector over the last generation compared to other sectors of the economy. Very little improvement. And the productivity of the sector relative to other advanced countries is poor. And that reflects the fragmented nature of the sector. We don't have enough larger companies. Companies that were here folded and left during the crash. And a big challenge for us is to assist the sector on modernisation and to attract new entrants into this market to have a much more competitive and productive market which can provide the infrastructure that we all need. So in conclusion, I think the challenges we do face, there are many ways, there are challenges of success. Much of what we're doing well, but I think we do realise that for aspects of infrastructure, particularly for more complex bespoke projects, we do need to improve, and we need to improve how we go about and plan and ultimately execute these projects. Thank you very much.